The letter arrived before the woman did. It was waiting for Leon on the freight agent's desk in Harmony Creek, Nevada, a crisp white envelope stark against the clutter of manifests and shipping receipts. The agent, a man whose patience had been baked out of him by the relentless summer sun of 1878, slid it across the counter without a word. He pointed a grimy finger at the name scrawled on the front, a phonetic approximation of hers, next to the name of the man who was supposed to be her husband, Mr. Alastair Sterling. Leanne's hands, stiff from the long wagon journey, fumbled with the seal. The paper inside was thick, expensive. The English words were a dark, unforgiving script she had painstakingly learned to read over the past year. They were short, brutal, and clear. Circumstances have changed. The arrangement is void. Your appearance is deemed unsuitable for a man of my station. Do not attempt to contact me. 8 Sterling. The words hit her not with the force of a blow, but with the deadening weight of an anchor dropping in an empty sea. Unsuitable. The single word echoed in the vast, noisy silence of her mind. She stood there, a small figure in a tattered, travel-stained grey cheongsam, the dust of 3 territories settled into its seams. Her small wooden trunk sat at her feet, containing everything she owned in the world. The sounds of Harmony Creek, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a passing ore cart, the loud laughter of men spilling from a saloon, pressed in on her, alien and threatening. She had no money for a return passage, no family, and no knowledge of this harsh, sun-bleached country beyond the promises made in letters that now felt like lies. The freight agent cleared his throat, a sound like gravel turning over. Well? You got business here, miss, or are you just talking your up air? She could not form a reply. She simply stared at the letter, her world shrinking to the size of that single sheet of paper. She was a ghost, arrived at a haunting that had already ended. From across the dusty street, Jasper Calloway watched the scene unfold. He had come into town for flour and salt, a trip he dreaded. His twin 6-year-old sons, Sam and Nate, held his hands, their small fingers clutched tight in his calloused grip. They were mirror images of each other, with the same unruly brown hair and serious, watchful eyes. Jasper saw the woman at the freight office, saw the way her shoulders slumped after reading the paper in her hand. He recognized the particular stillness of someone who had just run out of road. He knew who she was. The whole town had been whispering for weeks about the picture bride Alastair Sterling was importing, as if she were a piece of fine china or a new breed of cattle. Sterling, owner of the mercantile and the town's self-appointed arbiter of respectability, had made a great show of it. Jasper had seen the pride in the man's eyes, the pride of a collector, not a husband. Now, it seemed, the collection had been refused upon delivery. Sam tugged on his hand. "Pa, can we get a candy stick?" "Not today, son," Jasper said, his eyes still on the woman. He saw the freight agent gesture dismissively, turning away to serve another customer. The woman was left standing alone, a small, grey island in the river of bustling town life. People stared, whispered, and walked around her. She was an object of curiosity and scorn. Jasper felt a familiar ache in his chest, the hollow space left by his wife Martha's passing a year ago. It was a loneliness so profound it had its own physical weight. He looked down at his boys. Their clothes were clean but patched, their faces scrubbed, but he saw the wildness in them, the untended grief of 2 little boys growing up without a mother's touch. He was a good father, he knew that. He worked his homestead from before sunrise to after sunset, but he could not mend the parts of them that were fraying. He could not provide the softness, the quiet hum of a woman's presence that made a house a home. He was losing them, little by little, to a silent, rough sorrow. An idea, desperate and foolish, took root in his mind. It was a wild seed planted in barren ground, but it was the only seed he had. He squeezed his son's hands. "Stay with me," he whispered, and began to walk across the street. The dust swirled around his worn boots. The town's noise seemed to fade as he approached her. Leon looked up as his shadow fell over her. She saw a tall, weathered man, his face lined by sun and worry. He was not handsome, not like the photograph Sterling had sent. His eyes were a pale, tired blue, but they held no judgment. They held a deep, familiar exhaustion. His two small sons peeked out from behind his legs, their expressions a mixture of fear and fascination. Jasper stopped a respectable distance away. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect that made a few onlookers pause and stare. He wasn't a man for fancy words. He began, his voice low and raspy from the dust. I saw. I overheard. I mean no disrespect. Lian clutched the letter in her hand. She braced herself for an insult, another dismissal. But the man didn't mock her. He looked from her to his two boys, and then back again. His gaze was direct, almost pleading. My name is Jasper Calloway. These are my sons, Sam and Nate. The boys offered a shy, simultaneous nod. I am a widower, Jasper continued, the words coming out plain and unadorned. My wife, she's been gone a year. The boys, they need a mother. My homestead needs a woman's hand. I can't offer you silks or a fine house in town like Sterling could have. I have a small piece of land, a sturdy cabin, and an honest name. It ain't much. He paused, gathering his courage. The words he was about to say were the most reckless of his life. He looked directly into her eyes, trying to convey the truth of his desperation. The town will talk. They'll look down on us both. But I will offer you my protection. I will put a roof over your head and food on your table. I will be a decent husband to you. He took a deep breath, and finally spoke the heart of his plea, the raw, unvarnished truth of his need. Be my children's mother. The proposition hung in the hot, still air between them. It was not a proposal of love, or even of affection. It was a pact of survival, a drowning man offering a piece of driftwood to another. Lian looked from his earnest, tired face to the two small boys who were now staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. In their faces, she did not see the cold judgment of Sterling's letter. She saw a need as vast and as desperate as her own. She had come across an ocean seeking a home and had found only a locked door. This man was offering her a key. It might lead to a hard, lonely room, but it was a room, and right now, that was more than the entire world had to offer. Slowly, deliberately, she let the crisp, cruel letter from Alistair Sterling fall from her fingers. It fluttered to the dusty ground. She looked at Jasper Calloway and gave a single, firm nod. The wagon ride to Jasper's homestead was a journey into silence. The clatter of the wheels and the rhythmic plodding of the horses were the only sounds that filled the vast, dry landscape of the Nevada territory. Lian sat on the hard wooden bench, her trunk tucked behind her, her hands folded in the lap of her gray dress. Jasper sat beside her, his body a study in tense quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The boys, Sam and Nate, were in the back of the wagon, nestled amongst sacks of flour and potatoes. They whispered to each other, their voices too low for Lian to understand, their eyes darting towards her and then quickly away. The homestead, when they finally reached it, was even more stark than Jasper had described. It was a small cabin made of rough-hewn timber, chinked with mud, sitting alone in a sea of sagebrush and dust. A corral held 2 horses, and a half-finished barn stood nearby, its frame like the skeleton of some great beast. The place didn't feel empty, it felt haunted by a profound absence. Jasper pulled the wagon to a halt. "We're here," he said, the words sounding inadequate. He helped her down, his hand briefly touching hers. It was rough, calloused, but his touch was careful. Inside, the cabin was a single room, swept clean but relentlessly masculine. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a large table and 3 chairs stood in the center, and 2 bunks were built into the far wall for the boys. A smaller, curtained-off alcove held a narrow bed that was clearly Jasper's. There was no space for her. The realization landed with a quiet thud. I'll move my things to the barn," Jasper said, seeing the direction of her gaze. "You and the boys can have the cabin." "No," Lian said, her voice surprisingly firm. It was one of the few English words she felt sure of. She pointed to the floor near the hearth. "I sleep here." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. She would not displace him from his own home. The first week was a careful, silent dance. Leon rose before the sun, rekindling the fire and putting coffee on to boil. She found Jasper's store of beans and bacon and had a simple breakfast ready when he and the boys awoke. She learned the rhythm of the homestead, Jasper's long days in the fields, clearing rocks and trying to coax life from the dry soil, the boys' wild, unsupervised games that often ended in tears or injury. It was one such injury that broke the silence. Nate, the more reckless of the two, fell from the corral fence and landed hard, opening a deep, ugly gash on his forearm. His screams brought Jasper running from the field, his face pale with panic. Leon was there first. Jasper fumbled for a rag and the whiskey he used for cleaning wounds. "Hold him still," he ordered, his voice tight with fear. But Leon gently pushed him aside. She knelt by the crying boy and spoke to him in a soft, low murmur, a stream of Chinese that was less about words and more about tone. It was the sound of comfort, ancient and universal. Nate's sobs quieted to whimpers. She examined the wound with a clinical calm, then went to her trunk. She pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were dried leaves and a small jar of a dark, pungent salve. "What is that?" Jasper asked, his voice full of suspicion. "For cleaning." "For closing," she said, using the simple English words she had. She crushed the leaves, mixed them with a little water to form a paste, and gently applied it to the wound before spreading the salve over it and binding it with a clean strip of cloth torn from one of her own undergarments. Throughout the process, she never stopped her soft murmuring to Nate. Within minutes, the boy was calm, his tear-streaked face showing more curiosity than pain. Jasper watched, stunned into silence. He had seen countless ranch hands patch themselves up, but he had never seen anything like this. It was not medicine, it was a kind of art. He looked at Leon, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a solution to his problem, but as a person. He saw a competence and a quiet strength that he had completely overlooked. The next week, they had to go to town for supplies. The trip filled Jasper with a cold dread. He knew what was waiting for them. As they walked towards the mercantile, he felt the stares like physical blows. Women pulled their children closer. Men stopped talking and turned to watch them pass. Harmony Creek had passed its judgment. Alistair Sterling was waiting on the porch of his store, polishing a pair of spectacles with a silk handkerchief. He was a portly man, dressed in a fine suit despite the heat, his face a mask of smug superiority. He watched them approach, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. "Calloway," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "I see you've taken in my discarded mail. Does your charity know no bounds?" Jasper felt his fists clench. He put a protective hand on Sam's shoulder. "She's my wife now, Sterling. You'll speak of her with respect." Sterling laughed, a short, barking sound. "Wife? You insult the institution of marriage. Look at her. A filthy creature, straight off the boat. What kind of example is that for these boys? Have you no shame, man?" The word filthy struck Leon harder than any stone. She understood it perfectly. She saw the townspeople gathering, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She felt the shame Sterling intended for her, hot and suffocating. But then she looked at Sam, who was hiding behind Jasper's leg, his little body trembling. His fear was greater than her shame. Ignoring Sterling, ignoring the crowd, Leon knelt down. She pulled Sam from behind his father's leg and looked him in the eye. "Is okay," she whispered, her voice for him alone. She smoothed his hair, her touch gentle and reassuring. She straightened the collar of his shirt. Her focus was so complete, so absolute, that she created a small pocket of safety in the middle of the hostile street. She was not a victim. She was a mother protecting her child. The act was simple, but its effect was profound. The crowd saw not a filthy creature, but a woman caring for a frightened boy. They saw a quiet dignity that Sterling's loud blustering could not touch. Jasper, seeing this, felt a surge of something fierce and protective. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and dangerous. The next time you speak of my wife, you will use her name. It's Mrs. Calloway. And if you can't manage that, you won't speak to me or my family at all." He turned his back on Sterling, a definitive, public dismissal. He took Nate's hand, while Leon kept her hand on Sam's shoulder. Together, the four of them walked past the mercantile and down the street to the smaller, less stocked supply store at the edge of town. The surface conflict was over, but Jasper knew this was far from the end. Sterling was a man who did not forgive a slight, especially a public one. As they left, Jasper caught the eye of the town marshal, a man known to be in Sterling's pocket. The marshal's expression was not neutral. It was a cold, calculated warning. What Jasper did not yet know was that Sterling's anger was about more than just wounded pride. It was about the very land under Jasper's feet, and the water that ran beneath it. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the heavy quiet that follows a battle. The boys were asleep in their bunks, exhausted by the tension of the day. Leon was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in one of Nate's shirts, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. Jasper poured 2 cups of coffee, the last of their supply, and set one on the small stool beside her. She looked up, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "For what you did today." "For Sam." She simply nodded, her eyes returning to her work. He sat at the table, cradling his cup in his hands. The confrontation in town had cracked something open in him, a wall of grief and exhaustion he had kept carefully sealed. "My Martha," he began, the name feeling strange on his tongue after a year of disuse. She was born in this territory. She knew the land. Knew how to make things grow. When the fever took her, it took the heart of this place with her. He looked around the stark cabin. "This isn't a home. It's just a shelter. I work the land from sunup to sundown, but nothing thrives. It's like the soil itself is in mourning." "The boys?" "I see her in them, but I don't know how to reach it. I'm failing them." The confession left him feeling raw and exposed. Leon set aside her sewing. She looked at him, her gaze direct and steady. "Why he?" she said, her English slow and deliberate. "Mr. Sterling, why he so angry?" "Pride," Jasper said immediately. But he knew it was more than that. He got up and walked to a small wooden chest in the corner. He pulled out a folded document. "This is my homestead claim. 160 acres. The law says I have to live on it and make improvements for 5 years, then it's mine. I'm only a year in." He spread the map on the table. "My plot is here. Sterling owns all the land around it." He traced a thin blue line with his finger. "And this is Harmony Creek. It runs right through my property. It's the only reliable water for miles. Sterling thought this land would go to the railroad, but the survey changed. I filed my claim the day it became public. He's been trying to get me off it ever since." Suddenly, Sterling's rejection of Leon made a chilling kind of sense. It wasn't just prejudice. It was a strategy. By shaming and isolating her, he was also shaming and isolating Jasper, making him a pariah. An outcast would have a harder time getting credit, buying supplies, or finding help. An outcast was easier to break. Leon studied the map, then looked at Jasper. She walked to her own small trunk by the hearth and opened it. Most of its contents were practical, a few items of clothing, the bundle of herbs, a small, worn book. From the very bottom, she pulled out a cloth-wrapped parcel. She brought it to the table and carefully unwrapped it. Inside were not jewels or silks, but dozens of small paper packets, each filled with seeds and marked with Chinese characters. She pointed to one. "This," she said, picking up a few dark, wrinkled seeds, "grows in hard soil. Needs little water." She pointed to another packet. "This vine. It covers ground. Keeps moisture in soil." She went through half a dozen packets, explaining in her limited English the properties of each plant. Her family, she conveyed through gestures and simple words, were not wealthy farmers. They had worked a small, difficult plot of land in a dry province. They survived not by having the best land, but by knowing how to make the most of what they had. Jasper stared at the seeds as if they were gold nuggets. He looked at her hands, which he now realized were not the soft hands of a lady, but the capable, knowing hands of a farmer. He had asked for a mother for his children. He had not realized he might also be getting a partner who could save his land. A sliver of hope, the first he'd felt in a year, began to dawn in him. But it was extinguished almost immediately by a sharp rap on the cabin door. Jasper's body went rigid. No one ever came to his homestead, especially not after dark. He opened the door to find Marshal Thompson standing there, his face impassive, a lantern held high in one hand. "Calloway," the marshal said, not bothering with pleasantries. He held out a piece of paper. "Official notice. A territorial inspector will be out to review your claim. He's looking to see if you're meeting the improvement requirements of the Homestead Act." Jasper's blood ran cold. "An inspection? I'm not due for one for another 2 years." Sterling filed a complaint, the marshal said, his eyes flicking past Jasper to Leon, a flicker of contempt in his gaze. "Cited neglect and failure to cultivate. The inspector will be here in 1 week." 1 week. It was an impossible timeline. His fields were mostly cleared rock. He had a small vegetable patch that was barely surviving. There was no way he could show enough progress to satisfy an inspector, especially one sent by Alistair Sterling. It was a legal death sentence for his claim. The land, the water, his entire future, Sterling had found a way to take it all. Jasper took the notice, the paper feeling as heavy as a gravestone. He felt the last of his fight drain out of him. He was a widower with 2 sons and a stranger for a wife, and he was being squeezed out by the most powerful man in town. He closed the door and leaned against it, the notice trembling in his hand. "Here's one," he said, his voice hollow. "There's no way. A week is not enough time." He expected Leon to be frightened, to retreat. Instead, she walked to the table and picked up one of the packets of seeds. She looked not at him, but through the cabin's single window, out at the dark, sleeping land. 1 week, she said, her voice quiet but clear, a steel blade wrapped in silk. She turned to face him, her eyes burning with a fire he had not seen before. "We work." For months later, the first chill of autumn was beginning to settle over the high desert. The relentless heat of summer had given way to cool nights and bright, clear days. The change was most visible at the Calloway homestead. Where there had once been a patch of dusty, struggling plants, there was now a sprawling, thriving garden. Leon, using knowledge passed down through generations, had shown Jasper how to dig irrigation channels from the creek, diverting a small, steady stream of water. Her hardy seeds had taken root in the unforgiving soil, producing a surprising bounty of melons, squashes, and strange, leafy greens the boys had never seen before. The frame of the barn was now fully walled and roofed, filled with hay for the winter. A small chicken coop, built by Jasper from scrap lumber, housed a dozen hens that provided them with fresh eggs every morning. The cabin itself felt different. A porch had been added, and on it sat pots of herbs Leon had cultivated. The air no longer carried the scent of dust and grief, but of baking bread and drying herbs. It smelled like a home. The territorial inspector had come and gone. He had been a stern, humorless man, but he was fair. He had walked the property with his ledger, making notes. He had seen the irrigation, the new construction, the flourishing garden, and the healthy livestock. He had seen Sam and Nate, no longer wild and grieving, but helping Leon harvest vegetables, their laughter echoing in the clear air. He had seen a family putting down roots, their sweat and determination written on every inch of the land. He had looked at Jasper, then at Leon, and given a curt, professional nod. The complaint was dismissed. The Calloway claim was secure. Alistair Sterling's power play had backfired. When word got out that his complaint had been unfounded, people in town began to see his actions for what they were, the petty cruelty of a bully. Folks who had once courted his favor now gave him a wide berth. Business at his mercantile slowed as more people began trading at the smaller supply store, tired of Sterling's arrogance. His public shaming of Leon had ultimately led to his own. One crisp afternoon, Jasper stood by the corral fence, watching his family. Leon was showing the boys how to properly braid onions to be hung for storage. She was no longer wearing the grey cheongsam of her arrival. It had been cut up for cleaning rags long ago. Now she wore a simple calico dress Jasper had bought for her, the fabric practical and sturdy. Her hands, which had once seemed so delicate, were now brown from the sun and calloused from work, just like his. She looked up and saw him watching. A small, shy smile touched her lips. In 4 months of shared labor and quiet companionship, they had spoken few words of personal feeling. They had communicated through action, through the shared goal of survival. They had built a life together before they had even truly learned to speak to one another. He walked over to her. The boys, seeing him approach, ran to show him the lumpy, imperfect onion braid they had made together. He praised them, his heart swelling with a feeling so full it almost hurt. He sent them off to check the chicken coop for eggs. When they were alone, he turned to Leon. He reached out and took her hand. He traced the lines on her palm, a map of the hard work that had saved them all. "The circuit preacher is coming through Harmony Creek next week," he said, his voice quiet. He had thought about this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I was thinking, it's time we made this proper. In the eyes of God and the law." It was not a declaration of grand passion. It was something better. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of the truth that had grown between them in the soil of his homestead. She was already his wife in every way that mattered. Leon looked from his tired, honest face to the sturdy cabin, to the thriving garden, to the 2 boys running and laughing in the distance. This was the home she had crossed an ocean for. This was the family she had never known she was looking for. Her journey had not ended in rejection on a dusty street, it had begun there. She squeezed his hand, her answer not in words, but in the simple, powerful pressure of her touch. A real, unguarded smile spread across her face, bright as the afternoon sun. Their life together had not been born of love, but of necessity. Yet in the shared silence, the turned earth, and the quiet understanding of 2 lonely souls, they had found something far more resilient, something they had both earned, a family. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.